What are racism and sexism? Let's begin by examining the terms race and gender and taking note of a few things. Also, keep in mind that sexism is technically based on one's gender, not their sex. First, both are modern terms that were created within the last few hundred years. Ancient societies didn't pay as much attention to these physical differences. Instead, people were divided according to their religion, status, class, and language. 2. Both are constructed by the societies that use them. They do not reflect biological features, not like ancestry and sex, and they vary from culture to culture. Plus, there's not a single trait that's characteristic of one racial group or one gender. There's just as much variability within each group as there is between it and other groups. Third, the terms are complex. They are not always easily discernible, and some people may identify with multiple racial groups or as non-binary, transgender, or another gender identity. And finally, the terms are interdependent. They intersect to create different experiences for different people. They also intersect with other variables, like age, religion, and sexual orientation. For example, Black women may have a different experience in a social situation than white women and Black men and others. Social psychologists are interested in the unique experiences created by the intersectionality of multiple social identities. The research suggests that people who identify as the minority across multiple categories sometimes feel like they have multiple strikes against them in terms of power and status. As we move forward with this lecture, this information will help explain how social psychologists define and measure the concepts. At the individual level, racism is prejudice and discrimination based on a person's assumed racial background and the stereotypes associated with their group. At the institutional level, racism is the social and institutional practices that promote one racial group over others. Even before the U.S. was founded, the economy was based largely on slavery. In the early 1600s, a person's race was used as an excuse to enslave them and deny them basic human rights. As the concept evolved, it was used to justify the murder of indigenous people, the exclusion of Asian immigrants, and the taking of Mexico's land. The assumptions behind these practices were then embedded within the government, its legislation, the public school system, and so on. Today, the assumptions live on as there are still institutional and cultural practices that promote one racial group over others. For example, hiring managers tend to choose white applicants over people of color who have the exact same resume and even the same name. Over the last few decades, interactions between racial groups have improved, leading to an overall decrease in prejudice. In addition, modern forms of racism tend to be more covert and indirect than before, so much so that people, as perceivers, do not always recognize when their actions are subtly racist. This is called implicit racism. It operates unconsciously, without awareness, and unintentionally, without intent. But its effect on the target is just as negative as with overt racism. In fact, because perceivers are not aware of its effects on themselves or the targets, this form of racism does not activate feelings of guilt, like more direct forms. One type of implicit racism is called racial microaggressions. These are subtle but hurtful messages directed at people of color by others, usually white people, who are unaware of the hidden meaning being communicated. These messages can be sent verbally, non-verbally, or symbolically. Here are a few examples of verbal racial microaggressions. Maybe you've heard someone say to a person of color, "Oh, you don't have an accent." This statement alone is not racist, but in the social context, the assumption, the inference, the insinuation behind the statement is that all people of color are foreign and speak with an accent. The assumptions behind the statements are what makes them so detrimental to social interactions. Take a moment to pause the video and review the other examples presented here. An example of a nonverbal racial microaggression is a store owner following a person of color around the store, or a police officer stopping a person of color, because of the perceiver's internalized negative stereotypes, not because of the target's behavior. One example of a symbolic racial microaggression is the use of indigenous people as mascots for sports teams. At the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, the mascot used to dress in stereotypical attire and dance around the football field in stereotypical ways. The problem is the attire and the behaviors were not representative of the Illinois people. Instead, the whole presentation made a mockery of an extinct culture. The hidden meaning was that indigenous people are savages and their culture is entertaining, but not respectable. Another example of a symbolic racial microaggression is the display of the Confederate flag, because the people who display it believe it to be a symbol of their racial superiority. Although the battle flag was never adopted by the Confederate Army, it became a symbol of white supremacy in the 1940s when members of the Dixiecrat Party adopted it as part of their segregationist agenda. Now let's turn our attention to a related concept, sexism. At the individual level, sexism is prejudice and discrimination based on a person's gender. Note that gender is the relevant construct, not sex. Technically, sex is male, female, and intersex, a quality that we cannot know just by looking at how someone presents themselves in public. This is a biological construct that would require a sample of the target's DNA. Note that even a physical examination of a target's reproductive organs can be misleading, as some forms of intersexuality are not discovered until a DNA test is performed. Instead, sexism is based on the target's gender, the way that people present themselves in public. Institutional sexism is the social and cultural practices that promote the domination of one gender over others. For example, in the U.S., boys and girls are treated differently from the moment they are born. Blue for boys, pink for girls. Boys play with machines, girls play with dolls. Boys are told to study math and science. Girls are told to study language and the arts. Boys are responsible for girls' safety. Girls look to boys for protection. By the time they reach adulthood, men and women have been conditioned to fulfill their gender roles. In addition, other genders are largely ignored, harassed, and ostracized, which are also forms of sexism. Although similar in many ways, sexism is different from other forms of prejudice and discrimination in at least two ways. First, gender stereotypes are not just descriptive. They're also prescriptive, meaning they represent what society believes people should be, how they ought to behave. Second, in-group and out-group members are very familiar with each other. Usually, familiarity tends to reduce prejudice, but it's not the case with sexism. Another important point for us to consider is the study of ambivalent sexism, which is characterized by both hostile sexism and benevolent sexism. Hostile sexism includes negative, resentful beliefs about a gender's characteristics. For example, the attitude that women just want men's money, or that men are heartless. Benevolent sexism includes affectionate but patronizing beliefs about a gender's characteristics. For instance, the notion that women need to be cherished and protected. Objectification also qualifies as benevolent sexism. Both genders are sometimes treated like objects of attention and entertainment as opposed to human beings. This kind of treatment can have a negative effect on the target's performance and health. The two types of sexism are positively correlated in that people who hold hostile beliefs also tend to hold benevolent beliefs. And people who score high on both tend to have negative reactions to stereotype inconsistent behaviors. That is, their beliefs are so strong that they expect people to behave in ways that are consistent with the stereotypes ascribed to them. Ambivalent sexism is prevalent in cultures across the globe. People tend to score highest on both types in countries with high levels of economic and political inequality. In the U.S., stereotypes about women tend to be more positive than stereotypes about men. However, the qualities that are associated with women tend to be less valued. For example, women are stereotyped to be more nurturing than men, but roles that require a great deal of nurturing, like parenting, teaching, and working at a daycare, are not paid as well as roles that do not, like lawyer, doctor, and accountant. In addition, women who behave in ways are not consistent with the nurturing stereotype, those who exhibit what are called masculine traits, are seen as more competent in their job. but at the same time they are perceived to be less socially skilled because they do not fit their prescribed gender role. This perception can then have a negative effect on their future job opportunities. For both genders, holding a job that is stereotypically associated with the other gender can be especially challenging. For instance, both men and women in stereotype inconsistent occupations are judged more harshly for their mistakes than people working in stereotype consistent occupations. Sex discrimination is thought to be one contributing factor to sex differences in occupational choice, pay, and the likelihood of being promoted in the U.S. Returning to the example of institutional sexism, sex discrimination begins before birth, and throughout childhood, boys and girls are treated differently. They play with different toys, are expected to respond differently to danger and conflict, and are encouraged to specialize in different subjects. These subtle differences in treatment likely pave the way for differences in occupational choice later in life. Then, when men and women compete for the same job, sex discrimination may play a role once again. Research suggests that hiring managers tend to hire men for management and leadership positions and women for support positions. Recall that one of the negative effects of stereotyping is stigmatization. In the next part of the lecture, you'll learn about another negative effect, stereotype threat, and the way it impacts the individual.